Well, it's hard to believe, but we've actually made it to episode 250 of Don't Talk TV. So I thought for this milestone, we'd have a special guest, and we're going to have one of the very few lawyers out there who I would consider of like mind with myself, and who I will willingly spend time chatting with, Derek Fromm from Alberta. So he and I have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about. So let's get right into the episode. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. And joining me today from Alberta is Derek Fromm. He's a lawyer out there, has experience in constitutional law. I met him during COVID, and as I said in the preamble there, one of my common lines to people is, well, I can't recommend a lawyer to you because I don't network with other lawyers because I find most of them to be Marxists, and I don't like spending time with them. But fortunately, Derek is an exception to that. So Derek, we're really glad to have you. Thank you for being on.
Thanks for the invitation.
So it's been a little while. We did a few shows together during COVID. I remember we did the Shadow Davis show at least once. But yeah, it's been a little while. So what do you, just to give our viewers a bit of an idea of what kind of stuff are you up to these days?
Well, in the last while, I've kind of put a moratorium on my political involvement and also on my public advocacy. It was draining me, to be honest. During COVID, during the pandemic, very early on, I came to very strong views about it, both by avoiding the mainstream media, the legacy media, and by actually, I took an online course on virology at the time that was still offered for free. Now I can't even remember which institution it was, but it was an Ivy League East Coast sort of institution where I learned quite a bit, and I think it was very helpful for me to form my views. And it gave me enough of a background that I could discern truth from falsity to a degree, and also politics from science. So that honestly, that the first probably 2 years of the pandemic, I had hundreds of hours of pro bono work that I gave to clients. I made the mistake of using my Twitter account to say sometime in the summer of 2021 to say I will do a free half-an-hour consultation regarding employment law and vaccine mandates. And that kept me busy, I would say, sadly, kept me busy without pay for at least 4 months. And create a little bit of chaos for the staff here at the firm where I work in Airdrie, Alberta, because there was lots of people interested. And I can say in hindsight, it was very discouraging to me not doing the pro bono, not being unpaid for that period of time. But the fact that what I felt I was giving was advice based upon the law and the rules that have been long established in Canada regarding these sorts of issues. And then what was happening is I would do a risk analysis with my clients and say, look, what we need to do for you is find a tailored solution for you, which means keeping you employed as long as possible. And I would say that of all the lawyers that have made that have done this sort of work in Canada to date, I would say that I probably made the least money, but I had the most effect. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's true or not, but so many clients came back to me and said, look, my employer did this to me, and I responded like this, and I postponed it, and then the vaccine mandates disappeared, and I still have my job. And many of those that ended up in arbitration, and other like union members that ended up in arbitration, I'm hearing now as they're going through the processes still that, look, the union finally provided me with a lawyer. We're going through the process, and everything that you told me back then is what they're saying now. And so I feel good about what I did, but I was very discouraged, and I basically unplugged from all of that sort of work for two reasons. One being I was just burned out and very frustrated with what I saw as effectively an attack on the rule of law coming from our politicians and maybe from our courts. I'm not as certain about that, but certainly from politicians. And the next thing is I unplugged because I was very involved in politics for that time as well, including writing a paper called the Free Alberta. I'm forgetting now. It's a white paper that was produced by Rob Anderson, myself, and Barry Cooper from the University of Calgary. And it was about the Free Alberta strategy, which then ultimately resulted in the Alberta Sovereignty Act after Danielle Smith was elected as premier.
All right. Well, we're definitely going to talk about some of that stuff. So people that are you're just joining the video now, stick around because we're going to talk about a lot of what Derek was just talking about. We'll talk about the Alberta Sovereignty Act. We'll talk about whether he thinks Alberta, there's actually a realistic chance of Alberta separating, and a few other things. But before we get into all the heavy stuff, we got to do a little bit of fun stuff. We were talking about this at the beginning. I know on your Twitter that you've deleted, used to say you were the only lawyer who could deadlift
600 pounds. 600
pounds?
Yeah.
Okay. So what's your deadlift like now?
Well, right now it's pretty poverty, let me tell you. I'm untrained currently because I'm involved in my family's outside of school life so heavily. But when I was training seriously, 600 pounds. Now I could probably pull 450 off the ground and injure myself doing it.
Yeah, well, the injuring yourself is that's the not good part. 450 is respectable. I think we were talking. We both got the home gym thing going on. I started my home gym during COVID. I don't know, is that when you built yours? Because I was going to Crunch Fitness here in Stratford, which was very reasonable, but then everything got shut down. I said, forget it. I'm building a home gym.
Yeah, no, I was earlier than that. I think the house that my family lives in now, we bought in 2012, and that was one of the things we invested in immediately because I'm still a firm believer that all of us need to intellectually challenge ourselves, physically challenge ourselves, and a well-rounded person has many different interests in their life, and so that's been mine, and I like it because there's a lot of personal competition in it. You don't have to go head-to-head with somebody else. If you have a home gym, you have an initial investment, and then you don't have to pay a membership fee after, which is wonderful, very freeing.
Well, and aside, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you what you're saying about the challenging self, being a well-rounded person, but also, as I said before, I think hitting the gym is a lot better for stress relief than cocaine and prostitutes and alcohol or whatever a lot of our colleagues do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I have an older brother who's an engineer. And he used to tell me when I was still in high school, he's older than me. He used to tell me that he took the job where he was working for an organization that did pro bono work essentially for clients. He was working at the Hugh McMillan Rehabilitation Center in Toronto, and he was, as an engineer, he was being paid less there than what he could work, in the oil patch here in Alberta or something like that. But he told me that it's worth being paid less and enjoying your work and feeling fulfilled in your work because many of his colleagues have to go on the weekend and drink and do drugs to forget the work that they hate. And having, that's not to say that work is always lovely, because it's not, it's work. But it is to say that there are definitely better ways to live than becoming addicted to substances and intoxicating yourself so you have to forget about the life that you hate so much. But weightlifting for me is the perfect vehicle for that, because it does actually make you think clearer, I think, and in a way that other exercise doesn't. And it's short, and it produces good results, especially for males. Produces good results in terms of hormonally and such. So highly recommended. And I would never be, I couldn't be a long distance runner. I've never been able to do that. And I just find it incredibly boring. And so I love to challenge myself in the gym.
Well, I don't know if we had some legacy media or maybe even some industrial medicine practitioners in here, they might be saying there's way too much neo-Nazism and white supremacy.
Yeah.
You're talking about this working out and like lifting weights.
Yeah. It's amazing. There's such it seems to me that there is a war on so-called masculinity. Now, I wouldn't say that weightlifting is an inherently masculine thing. Women need to be strong too, and everyone needs to challenge themselves. Not all of us are the same, but yeah, there definitely seems to be a bent in the media against eating meat, for instance, and don't get aggressive and all these things. But it takes me back to what my parents used to tell me is get angry, but in your anger, don't do something wrong. Mm-hmm. So it's about managing your emotions, but also pushing yourself and becoming the person that you would like to be, rather than being satisfied with the person you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's all good stuff. But we live in just such a crazy time that I can actually make that joke about white supremacy, and that's something that someone actually said in sincerity and actually believing it. I mean, I've just got to share my screen quickly here for just to show. I mean, this is a real thing. Time magazine here. Of course, I've got some big ad here blocking the top of my screen, but the white supremacist origins of exercise and 6 other surprising facts about the history of U.S. physical fitness. And, that's the article where they talk about, exercise trends go from reinforcing white supremacy to celebrating Richard Simmons. But anyway, they talk about the white supremacy. It's just...
Yeah, I think 7-time, 8-time Mr. Olympia Ronnie Coleman would love to hear that he's a white supremacist. Because he would be very surprised, I think.
Yeah. So I guess let's segue from that into the more serious stuff. And while I'm on the topic of screen sharing, let me just share something else here that you and I are familiar with, the good old Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And, this goes right back to what you were talking about just being disappointed during COVID, just seeing long-held legal principles just being destroyed. And I felt the same thing too. I mean, I just couldn't, stuff that I thought would never, ever happen in Canada, what we were seeing happening, and especially like the forced vaccination. I mean, I remember very clearly everyone, all the experts, all the legal beagles, they were all saying mandatory vaccination will never, ever happen in this country. It's legally impossible. And then all of a sudden, August 13th, 2021, the prime minister, as he was, Justin Trudeau, announced. Actually, no, it wasn't Justin Trudeau. It was Al Gabra, who was the minister of. I forget what he is the minister of.
I think transportation, perhaps.
Right. I think you're right. He was the one who announced it. And anyway, and then next thing you know, now all of a sudden the same experts are saying, no, this is totally normal. What are you talking about, you conspiracy theorists? Whereas about a month before that, the conspiracy theorists were the people saying that it was going to happen. But bit of a long preamble, but I'm zooming in here on the preamble here, the very first words of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I think this is worth talking about. I've talked about it before, and going back on this channel, and you and I have talked about it, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning, and why you're one of the few lawyers that I think we're on the same page on a lot of things, is because we have, if not identical, very similar understanding of this, where it says, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God in the rule of law. Yeah. So that's what the Charter says Canada is founded on. This should be informing everything that follows the rest of the document. But my view is that we've completely, collectively as a society, and certainly our government and our courts, have completely abandoned the supremacy of God portion of this. So it's not a big surprise that then the very next words, the rule of law, are kind of falling by the wayside. But, you were mentioning it before we went into the show that was something I want to talk about. So I'll hand it over to you of what you wanted to say about that after I've started this out.
So this particular issue is, I don't want to say near and dear to my heart because that's flaky, but it's been something that I've been aware of ever since and before I went to law school. A different brother, my oldest brother, his PhD thesis at Syracuse in political philosophy was on the history of sovereignty. Sounds dry, but it became very relevant during the COVID years. And the reason is because when you look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that's not a mistake. That is like as you said, the foundational or the most important phrase to underpin or supply content to the rest of the document. So when it talks in section 7 about the right to life, well, how are we supposed to interpret the right to life? Well, considering the supremacy of God and the rule of law. How are we supposed to construe and interpret a right to assembly? The same principles. And so even though the preamble may not be itself justiciable, you can't sue somebody on the basis of that. It's supposed to be an aid for the court or a decision maker and how to understand them, the rest of the document. And so when you look at the history of sovereignty up until Thomas Hobbes, so we're talking the 17th century, he was a political philosopher in England who was in a very tumultuous time when he was writing, and he wrote a book called Leviathan. And he probably didn't come up with it. There was a cultural movement at the time that he was writing in response to or in favor of. But what it did is it made the sovereign an arbitrary authority, meaning he dispensed with the supremacy of God, because the medieval understanding, and I would say the Christian understanding of a ruler's authority is this. At the top, there is God. Underneath there is the sovereign, the king, parliament, and underneath that is the rest of us. And so the sovereign recognizes that he is responsible to God because God is supreme. Mm-hmm. He recognizes that there's going to be a day in the future when he's going to have to answer for his actions. And it also recognizes, this is important, that the sovereign is himself a subject, like the rest of us. And then when the rule of law comes after that very important statement, the supremacy of God, that the ruler has to answer to God, it says the rule of law. Well, whose law is that? Mm-hmm. It's God's law. Now, we can argue about the content of that law, but historically, those of us in the common law tradition, based out of England, even I would say, I'm not familiar with other European countries' constitutions, but I would say because of the Christian background of Europe, I would hazard a guess that the law was in some way in the content was very Christian in nature.
Yeah, it depends on the country, because interestingly, the interesting thing is I think that as a bit of a historical anomaly, the supremacy of God may be more integral to common law and English constitution, because the constitutions in continental Europe have as their primary heritage the French Revolution, which
yes,
of course
which would be very different.
Which was a completely atheist, anti-Christian. I mean, the whole purpose of the French Revolution was to destroy everything that was, destroy the role of the church and God in society. I mean, they even came up with a 10-day work week. They came up with a whole new calendar. I mean, a lot of that didn't stick because the people were like, people just couldn't get things done. But the vast majority of Europe, because of how successful the French Revolution was and the fact that Napoleon conquered most of Europe, even though he was himself eventually beaten back, that seems to be the foundation of a lot of them. Although many countries, I'm not an expert, but I know some countries, they try to meld the two. Like I know the Polish constitution, which I know a bit more about Poland just because I have Polish background. My wife's Polish. I've spent some time there. Their constitution, it's kind of on that basis of the French Revolution system, that Republican system, but they've inserted into it the supremacy of God, and their constitution has a somewhat similar preamble. But
well, that's very interesting, because some of the best philosophers of sovereignty are actually French. Mm-hmm. And there's some irony to that. Maybe that's why they were writing, is in response to the French Revolution. I don't know. It wasn't my thesis. It wasn't my PhD thesis, so I'm not.
Well, yeah. I mean, history was my undergrad degree before law school. So I suspect it was probably maybe partly from the French Revolution, but also part of what I think allowed the French Revolution to happen, or is around the time of the French Revolution, is where you had the development of the absolute monarchy.
Yes.
Of that concept.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you very well said, historically, there'd been that concept of, well, no, the king is not absolute monarch. He's still subject to God. But then at a certain point, they started getting to the absolute monarchy. And I think that helped pave the way for a lot of these revolutions, because an absolute monarch is.
Well, it takes a worldview change, doesn't it? Right. You have to conceive of the world very differently. You have to, in some ways, erase the Christian God and then decide, hey, look, there's nothing else past the physical realm worth concerning ourselves with, and there's no ultimate responsibility of anyone for anything. And if you can replace all those things, you end up where we are today, which I think the supremacy of God in the Charter has effectively become, the appendix, the vestigial organ of Canada's Constitution. It doesn't seem to mean anything, and I think once you lose the supremacy of God, it's inevitable that the rule of law also becomes emptied out. And I think right now we're in the process, and COVID was a big step in that direction. The rule of law is being emptied out. And so we have incoherence in the law, I think, right now. There certainly is in Section 15 jurisprudence of the Charter, which is the equality section. And I think we have incoherence in Section 7 of the Charter as well. Like, for instance, right to life can save a serial murderer from extradition to the US because he might be executed there for his crimes, even though he's proven guilty and admitted them. But it has nothing to say about an unborn baby. So to me, that seems like a contradiction in the law that required the supremacy of God to be disregarded and the rule of law to begin to be emptied out. And so that's my concern, is without the supremacy of God and a ruler recognizing that he's going to answer for what he does, we end up with all sorts of problems. And I would say we end up with Jason Kenney in Alberta, who can put pastors in prison, because as James Coates is a pastor in Edmonton, and they were holding services throughout the lockdowns. And I don't need to retell the whole story. That's available online. But in the end, Pastor Coates, his argument was, when God's law contradicts the law of the state, both the state and me, Pastor Coates, are subject to God's law. One of us has to be wrong. And my view is that, and this is him speaking, my view is that I have to disobey ungodly laws. And so he felt compelled to disregard some of the COVID restrictions. Now, when I say that without any further explanation, it sounds like he's lawless. He is not lawless, because what that church tried to do was to accomplish the same purposes as the lockdowns, the restrictions did. They were testing. They were making sure that people who were sick, as best they could, weren't passing on the infection to others. But at the same time, they tried to obey God's law, which said you have to meet together for worship.
So they obeyed the state's law to the furthest extent that they could. Right. And I mean, of course, what you're saying, of course, is also setting aside. You want to talk about incoherence? Well, Black Lives Matter protests, thousands of people all crammed together in the streets. Apparently, COVID didn't spread at Walmart or Costco. It only spread if you're in a church. So, I mean, that's another aspect to it, the subject to God. But there is also there was just no coherence whatsoever to those. Well, there was no coherence unless you maybe took a more conspiratorial approach and thought, maybe they're actually using COVID as an excuse to try to shut down churches and disconnect people even more. I mean, I don't know. Do people even? Maybe we're both the wrong people to discuss this, because we're both pretty disconnected. But I wonder, do people even bother with weddings or funerals anymore after COVID? We're getting used to not having.
Well, I have attended both since COVID, but that could also be because I'm in Alberta, and Alberta shrugged off the restrictions pretty quickly. There's a few individuals who have been permanently psychologically harmed, in my view, by what we went through during the COVID era, and they'll never take their masks off. They'll never start thinking straight, and they'll be incapable for their entire life of saying maybe mistakes were made. There are a few of those. They're generally in urban settings, and they generally tend to be the sort of people that wanted to hear that anyway, because they don't want to have to get out in the social environments and interact with people. So I would say there's a predisposition. But there's also the other fact that, I had my home gym in 2012. So I kind of got ahead of the buy the gym during COVID. We turned off cable. We got rid of cable in 2014. And there's not been one regret, let me tell you.
Oh yeah. Well, that's
time. We're not subject to the propaganda that's being fed to us. And you know what's interesting is I don't think I was fully aware of the extent of the propaganda until COVID came along. And when I would hear things on the radio or the TV and snippets, either through Twitter or some other means, I'd be like, what on earth? This is such blatant propaganda. Because I'd look around in my social circles and I would say, none of what I've been told about is actually happening. How can people believe this? And it takes me back to Orwell that, the party has to convince you not to believe your eyes and ears in order to succeed.
Yeah. Don't believe your lying eyes. I mean, that was a huge thing during COVID. But I'm going to second the whole disconnecting from cable, because since 2005, I haven't had a cable connection or anything in my house. I mean, we have a couple TVs, but we only use them for watching select films on occasion that are kind of a curated collection. And I don't miss any of that stuff whatsoever.
It's very unlike investing your time listening to music, good quality music, or weightlifting. Like those are experiences that improve you. There is no way that anyone can say they're being improved by watching like the Food Network mindlessly for hours at a time. Like how pathetic. We don't do it. We watch somebody else do it. That's like when I used to catch my oldest boy watching YouTube videos. No, still have YouTube videos of other kids playing video games. Like what do you just play a game yourself? It's like there's a certain meta stupidity to all of this, where we don't want to participate in something. We'd rather watch somebody else participate. And I think that was one of the harmful effects of the COVID lockdowns too, is that it left a lot of people unused to social interactions, and like a muscle. Once you lose that muscle, it's hard to regain it. And I remember very early on, and I'm going to say May, or even it might have been April, but I think it was May, when Jason Kenney brought in his restrictions. And at that time, I'm told he was concerned with my tweets. I don't know if that's true or not. But I was told that by people who I think were in the know. And my one of my tweets was retweeted many hundreds and maybe even over 1,000 times by Albertans that I knew, many of them, about like, okay, now that you've locked us in, what's your exit strategy? And it turns out there never was an exit strategy. So I just cannot believe that when they locked us down originally, that they didn't have a plan to get us back together. And there literally was no plan. Can you imagine a general who has to fight against a foreign army, who doesn't have some sort of process for disengaging and peace at the end of it?
Well, although that seems to be the way our governments roll. I mean, after the way the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, that kind of smacked of, we had no exit plan. We just decided, okay, we're just going to pack up and leave, and we'll leave all these helicopters and Humvees and vehicles behind.
And we have a word for that too: incompetence. Like, and that epithet is perfectly suited to Jason Kenney. Incompetence. He is, he claims to be a Christian man, and he was going to enter the priesthood before he started working with what has now become CTF, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. But I see no evidence of it in the way he conducted himself during the pandemic. He even had on Danielle Smith's last radio show on the local station here in Calgary, he had a long diatribe of advice for Pastor Coates. And then he stuck him in prison.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if he were a Christian, he would have understood exactly why Pastor Coates did what he did.
Right. And I think it's important to point out, like, Pastor Coates was doing it in the most respectful and responsible manner. Like, to be, I guess, to be a bit of devil's advocate or not, I don't know if it's devil's advocate, but, there were some pastors who took things a little far and were just doing stuff. I don't want to be sounding flippant, but were being almost like, some of them I think were on purpose being provocative and like really in your face. That's not Pastor Coates that we're talking about here. Although, I have to say, in Ontario, interestingly, that's Ontario, everyone always thinks of Ontario being like the most liberal place, the worst place, but no pastors went to jail here. And there were churches here that were being pretty in your face about it.
Pastor Hildebrand.
The Church of God. They were live streaming their services in 4K on Facebook, like literally, like in your face to the government, like, hey, look what we're doing. We dare you to come charge us. And he did a few stunts where he's holding up the tickets, saying, I've received $200,000 worth of tickets. We're not going to stop. But they never threw him in jail. They never threw anyone in jail. They did charge a bunch of people. I did a few trials on that. I'll have to say it made it, in my view, it made it impossible for me to argue the charter when they were doing things like that, because I couldn't say they're at least trying to take some precautions. Like, with all due respect, you're watching these 4K videos, it kind of feels like they're just being scofflaws at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's hard to represent a scofflaw.
Yeah, I was able to do it by way of like just good old fashioned. Did you prove the identity? And we're able to, despite high definition, it's still difficult to identify people, even when it's in 4K, because if it's just panning around and you're seeing people in the background. But I think that's an important distinction to make. Like, even people like a Pastor Coates, who was trying to do everything he could, he wasn't just being a scofflaw. And I'm not saying the Church of God were just being scofflaws. I'm sure that they legitimately felt that was the right thing to do. But and see, with the difference of approach, if someone's going to go to jail, you'd think that would be the one. But in Ontario, they didn't put anyone in jail. And
I think there are reasons for that. The buck stops with Jason Kenney. He was the premier, but I think at the time his Minister of Justice was a fellow named Tyler Shandro. I think he's back in private practice now, and I'm told, and I don't know if this was an influence at all. I do not know, but Mr. Shandro was part of the, I think, Humanist Society. Or the Free Thinkers, something of that name. But anyway, atheist organization while he was at the University of Calgary studying at some point in his student career. And so there has been some speculation that Shandro was deputized by Kenney to handle the Christian problem. Meanwhile, I can remember during that period that Muslims getting together in community centers and such, that everyone looked the other way.
Oh, well, yeah, and there was lots of that around here too. But it's interesting also how the police approach things, because I will say again, like, in terms of premiers, it was all bad, but Doug Ford was probably actually one of the less bad premiers during Ontario,
strangely,
during COVID, oddly. But also the police in Ontario, and maybe it's because they weren't getting marching orders from above, were, in my experience, for the most part, doing what they could to avoid charging people. The few times that I encountered them, it was actually Canadians who were causing problems. Like, there was a church near me that on Easter Sunday, Easter Sunday of 2021, I think you were allowed to have services, but it had to be certain numbers. The local Waterloo Regional Police apparently received 80 complaints from people in the area. Now, I talked to friends who attend that church. They said the police showed up, but they just showed up and said, hey, we're here to let you know we've received 80 complaints, so we feel compelled to attend, but we know that you're allowed to have services. This is a church. Obviously, you're doing a religious service, so just make sure that you're abiding by the rules. And then they just left without going into some big investigation to see whether they're actually following the rules. And similarly, at my own church, once we're allowed outdoor services, someone called the police on us, but when the officer showed up, he just said, look, we got a report, so we have to attend, but outdoor services are allowed. This is clearly a religious service, so have a good day.
Well, I'm pleasantly surprised to hear that. I don't know if I'd actually realized that in contrast before. Things felt darker here in Alberta, and I thought that was maybe attributed to the fact that the population disagreed so much with what was happening, what being imposed on it, and it was very frustrating. It felt like we were that airplane circling the airport for hours at a time waiting to land, and it was a very frustrating time. I'm happy to leave it behind me, but now that I'm going to suffer PTSD or something from having this conversation. Yeah. Of course, I jest.
Well, that wasn't my intent, but that is a good excuse for us to move into some of the other things we wanted to talk about, because I don't want to just be reminiscing, if you can call it reminiscing, talking about that period of insanity. But I don't want to make you go into some huge discussion of it, but just since a lot of my viewers are from Ontario or not necessarily from Alberta, like the Alberta Sovereignty Act, can you give us like a brief kind of a Coles Notes version of what is that all about, and what have they
Okay, so I should say I think I mentioned this at the beginning. I was part of a group of individuals who wrote a white paper suggesting the Alberta Sovereignty Act as a part of a suite of legislation. And it was basically, it's a political document. I'll admit that white paper, it's not a well-argued legal document, but it's supposed to be to mobilize and inform voters about some of the existential might be exaggerating, some of the systemic problems that Alberta has in Confederation. One of those being, we have a federal election coming up. And for all intents and purposes, the election will be decided when polls close in Ontario.
Yep.
And when you look at the distribution of seats on the map, the electoral map, an Albertan's vote counts for much less than a vote of someone who lives in the Maritimes. And it's not supposed to be, so. And let me tell you what that means in case people miss the significance of that. It's that the constituencies resulting in one member of parliament going to Ottawa in the Maritimes, there's much fewer voters in those constituencies than in an Alberta riding. Excuse me. In Alberta, there might be 80,000 voters in a single constituency, resulting in one person going to Ottawa. Whereas in New Brunswick or PEI or some other place, there's much fewer voters. I'm going to make up a number. I don't know exactly what that number is. So let's say 15,000. So that means that votes on the East Coast are weighted more heavily than votes in Alberta, which is an equality issue under the charter probably, but no court will hear that or take it seriously. But so what happens then is all these seat-rich areas like Ontario, Quebec, and population-poor areas that are overrepresented end up sending MPs to Ottawa at a rate that Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC can't match. And now Alberta has been complaining about this for a long time. I'm sure listeners have or viewers have seen that old political cartoon of a cow that's eating in Alberta but being milked in Ontario. It's been pretty much since Alberta entered Confederation in 1905 that Albertans have been dissatisfied with how things are done, because it seems like Albertans are expected to pay for the excesses of Ontario and Quebec. So Quebec can say no to oil and gas going through the province, and they don't have to develop their own resources, but they will continue to accept equalization payments from Alberta even though they could make their own way. And it's basically Albertans feel like wealth is being extracted from this province. And wealth is work. You earn wealth by working. And so it's essentially we're being forced to work to provide for Ontario. And so that's the sentiment that was in part behind writing the white paper that we did. And so I was Danielle Smith's legal counsel during her campaign for leadership. And we fought to get her elected, and it was a lot of work, and we were up against some pretty big odds, but she was running on a platform of let's push Albertan sovereignty into the forefront in Ottawa's mind, not to leave Confederation, but to get a better deal for Alberta. And it starts to sound a little bit like the rhetoric in Quebec, and that was very intentional. Like if Quebec gets a special place, why shouldn't Alberta? Maybe we're all special.
No, I know, and it sure worked well for Quebec because I mean they've essentially held the country hostage for decades and essentially get bribed to stay in Confederation. Good work.
Yeah, so I mean,
considering how much Alberta contributes to the country.
Yeah, our goal wasn't to be hold the country hostage. Our goal was that let's get this systemic problem with Confederation solved, that Alberta pays for stuff. I mean, we kind of joke that the reason that wait lists for healthcare are much shorter in Ontario than here is because all of our money that could reduce that wait list are going to Ontario to keep that wait list down. And the last I saw from the Fraser Institute, that wait lists in Ontario were roughly 23 and a half weeks, where Alberta's are nearly double. And I can't remember, maybe it was around 40 weeks. And so we have sufficient resources in this province to pay our own way, but we're forced to pay for other so-called have-not provinces. And now the lunacy of it is Ontario is not a have-not province. Ontario could be very wealthy, but it doesn't need to be because Alberta is funding it. And Quebec, that could be said doubly. Quebec does not pull its weight in this confederation. And it's, as you pointed out, Nicholas, it's being, the incentives are there for it not to become independent and self-supporting because it can rely on Alberta to backstop it at all times. Mm-hmm. So when Danielle Smith was elected, it was soon after that leadership election that the Sovereignty Act was brought in. I wasn't involved in that, but my reading of it is basically that there's two steps. First, there's a recognition in the Act that sometimes, maybe oftentimes, the federal government acts contrary to the Constitution. And the Constitution Division of Powers in the Constitution Act 1867, sections 91 and 92, distribute almost every sort of power to either the province, legislative jurisdiction to either the province or the feds. And sometimes it can be difficult to decide which side it's on. Is it a federal jurisdiction or provincial? And so the Sovereignty Act allows the Alberta Governor and Council, allows the legislature to take a vote that they consider a certain federal action as infringing on its jurisdiction, and then the Governing Council can choose to make an order. And basically what it is it's a massive protest by the Alberta government against some sort of federal action being taken against Alberta and Albertans. And so in that sense, it achieves in a lot of ways what we talked about in the white paper, because it was at the beginning a political document made to inform and rally people behind a certain political view. And so this act, I think it's been used a number of times already and it's been threatened. And I would consider it a success. I think after it was drafted, we were able to get one of the former justices of the Supreme Court of Canada to endorse it. He said, yeah, this is constitutional legislation. And this is part of the conversation between legislatures. And Saskatchewan, I don't know if they ever enacted anything, but they were considering, at least at one point, of enacting mirror or parallel legislation.
Yeah, I heard that. I'm not sure whether they enacted or not. Interestingly, one of the smaller parties in the Ontario Party, part of their platform is that they want to bring in an Ontario Sovereignty Act. Not sure if Ontario needs it as badly as Alberta, just given the things we discussed and the way things work. The Ontario doesn't necessarily receive a huge amount more. I was just actually looking up some graphics of
equalization
payments.
Yeah.
And so I just found this one here that, as far as I know, is accurate. So, I mean, you can see, obviously, the lion's share going to Quebec, 51.4% from 57 to 2018. Even more so if you look 2020 to 2021 at the bottom there, they've received almost everything since 2020. Whereas Ontario only 4.4%, considering Ontario's population. They're not taking in as much. But then you see, like Alberta, Saskatchewan, they're paying out. But I mean, even places like Manitoba. I grew up in Manitoba. Mm-hmm. Manitoba has no shortage of natural resources and hardworking people. There, in my view, there's no reason for Manitoba to be a have. Well, there's no reason for any part of Canada really to be a have-not. But there's no reason for Manitoba to be a have-not province that needs to receive equalization payments. But really, that could probably be said of any province. There's so many natural resources. If people were just allowed to use them, but in the bizarro world we live in, you're only places like China and India are allowed to use what they have and mine it and refine it and all that. But if countries in specifically North America and Europe, if they do that, that's evil for some reason.
Yeah. It's a very strange, and again, our beef is not with the rest of Canada. Mm-hmm. The beef is with Ottawa. Ottawa's out of touch. And there used to be an old theory in constitutional law called watertight compartments. And seeing as we're talking about the rule of law previously, that was the original theory for how the provinces and the feds would interact, is that their jurisdiction was exclusive. And if you're treading on my jurisdiction, get out. Mm-hmm. But now there's, I don't know how long it's been, 25 years. There's been a new theory that's usurping the old proper, I would say, interpretation of the Constitution. And it's called cooperative federalism, where everyone can do whatever they want. That's pejorative. That's not really what it is. Right. But it seems arbitrary. It's the government has a great goal here, so we're not going to disallow them.
Well, it almost is. You can do it, everyone. I mean, that's maybe overstating it a little bit, but so I think COVID was so important for all that, because so many of these barriers were broken down and lines that previously wouldn't be crossed were crossed because, it's an unprecedented emergency. It's an unprecedented pandemic. So we have to do these things. And the point I tried making to people that unfortunately fell on deaf ears with most people is like, an emergency is when you need the rule of law and the laws we have to be enforced even more strictly, because there's so much more temptation to just throw all the laws out just so we can achieve this end. But then you have nothing left once the emergency is over. And I think we're seeing that same mentality of, well, we have a good plan or a good intention, a good end goal. So let's just forget what those laws that are in our way and let's just go do it.
Yeah, they're basically inconvenient. So we're going to ignore them. And then it's left to the courts to find on what principle can we rubber stamp the government's action and say that they're not ignoring the Constitution, they're not ignoring the law. This is really justified. And that becomes difficult too. I mean, I do have some pity for judges. I have a lot of pity for judges in civil litigation. Constitutional litigation, it is inherently a policy-making role. I don't see how it can be avoided. It is a blend of policy and law. And it seems that when it's government courts always decide in the favor of their master. And at the end of the day, who's the master? It's Ottawa. It is not you, not me, and not our clients.
And so, not God. I think that ties in with what you're saying at the beginning, because I mean, you can't. There is no other system. Like the judges have to be employed by someone.
Yeah.
So I don't like. It's not the fact that they're employed by the government that in and of itself is the problem. I don't think, because there has to be someone paying their wages. But it goes now. Their master, literally, as you said, their master is the government, and that's it. There's no one higher that the judges know that they have to answer to. Whereas I would think in a system where the sovereign or the supremacy of God is recognized, those judges, yes, technically the government is one level of master, but they have that ultimate master to answer to, and therefore they better make the right ruling, not just the ruling that they think the government or
that's absolutely correct. And so I've been reading an interesting book lately that deals with the rule of law and changes over time. And the one that really struck me, the change along the process, was Sir Oliver Wendell Holmes. I think I got his name right. I'm not thinking correctly here right now, but the American jurist. And there used to be a saying, and I think it originated back in the classical era, that law is rationality. And he famously quipped, "Law is experience," which is a very different thing.
Totally different, yeah.
Yeah, and if that's what the basis of our law is, experience, I think we've become unmoored from that rule of law. We've become unmoored from the supremacy of God.
Yeah,
if that's all it is.
Well, it's totally subjective. It's not objective. When it's experience, it's what have I experienced, or what has this person experienced, and but you can see that thread through a lot of our laws. A lot of stuff is about what people feel. I mean, we're in an era where, well, there aren't two genders according to some people. It's not how you were born. It's not what your DNA says. It's how do you feel? How have you experienced the world? Oh, you experience that you think you're, something else, and then that they're paying for the transition even, which is interesting because there's so many things that aren't paid for anymore. Like I've discovered that ingrown toenails, for example, in Ontario, that's not covered by OHIP. You have to pay that out of your pocket. So it's just like, well, wait a minute, like something like, or cancer medications, like, wait a minute, you have to pay
wart removal, vitamin D tests, testosterone tests. These are all things that governments have been getting rid of in their payment schedule because they're too expensive. Too many people want, and so they couldn't ration it, so they just took it off the schedule, pay for it privately.
Yeah. So I don't want to keep you too much longer because, like myself, I know you have a family that you want to get to, but I need to ask you, because I've got someone who lives in Alberta, like Alberta separation. Like, is that actually a realistic possibility, or is it just some people letting off steam, or some people who are very loud that get amplified on social media? And I just paused to note, this isn't a live episode for our viewers, if anyone's wondering. We're pre-recording this before the results of the federal election are in. So by the time you're watching this, the election will have happened, and maybe Derek's answer will be different depending on the outcome if it's a Mark Carney government. But either way, like what's your sense from being in Alberta? Is there any real traction or appetite for separation?
So I can give you my experience as someone who attends events with other Albertans. So when I talk to other, like my kids' activities, so if I talk to other parents, it's, I would say, very close to 100% of the Albertans I talk with regularly are in favor of some sort of sovereignty. Now, take that with a grain of salt, because there's already a selection. The people I hang out with probably believe like I do, and those who are invested in their children probably of a certain age and economic status. So I would say it's approaching 100%. I say 80 might be what it is. If those people today were to go to a voter booth and say separate or no, I believe there would be some hesitation in the voter booth to check that box.
There always is. April 22nd.
Yeah. And so there was quite a bit of kind of I guess joking acceptance when Trump quipped the 51st state. Albertans weren't immediately upset. I think they were like, "Oh, that'd be funny, haha." No one was offended, I don't think, other than those extreme people that are offended at everything. Do I think that means Albertans would be open to becoming a 50? I don't, because I think we'd quickly realize that would be under the thumb of a different power, and this time it's a foreign power on a further away coast. So do I think that would actually happen? Probably not, but it wasn't met with anger the way that it seems like the media, the legacy media, wants to portray Canadians as feeling. I don't think that anger was felt here, but I don't think there would be any follow through on that. Now, if Mark Carney wins the election, it will be very easy to sell it to Albertans. Now, Alberta is an interesting population. I'm from Saskatchewan. Many of my friends are from Ontario. Some are from the Maritimes. And it seems to me that much like the biblical idea that those who are forgiven much love a lot, those of us who come from economically dysfunctional areas of Canada tend to like Alberta a whole lot more and believe in Alberta a whole lot more. And so it's the New Brunswickers that are like, we need out of this country. And the Ontarians are often like that as well, but they tend to be professionals. And so they may couch their terminology differently because they're here for oil and gas. They're here as lawyers and engineers. People from Saskatchewan, like myself, Saskatchewan's polling for higher than Alberta is for separation.
Interesting.
So if Mark Carney wins, it could be very interesting times that we're headed towards. If the CPC wins, it will become interesting times for completely different reasons. It'll become a lot harder for Danielle Smith to critique the federal government. And she'll be fighting with one hand behind her back, essentially. She'll have to hold her blows. Because I do not believe for a second that a CPC government would actually make any systemic changes that we envisioned in our white paper. I don't hold my breath. It's not happening.
Well, I mean, I think you look at history. When has the Conservative Party or their predecessor, the Progressive Conservative Party, because let's be honest, the current iteration of CPC is basically the resurrection of the PCs. When have they ever in their entire history made systemic or substantive changes? It's just a pause on the progression of the Liberals, maybe a little bit of nibbling around the edges, like the long gun registry was done away with during Harper. But I mean, that's really some peripheral nibbling. I mean,
it is.
The Firearms Act itself needed to be overhauled, but we did away with the long gun registry, so we can say they did. But that's all they did. So this time around, if by the time people are watching this, Prime Minister is Pierre Poilievre, the orders in council banning practically every firearm under the sun, those will probably be canceled, but I don't think any substantive on firearms will really be changed. Likewise, the systemic things that you talk about, especially because Alberta voters are not who the Conservatives want to woo. I think they take CPC as like, well, look, that's like guaranteed seats in Alberta, guaranteed seats in Saskatchewan. We need to focus on trying to convert some people in the suburbs of Toronto. We need to try getting some people in Southwest Ontario, maybe a few here and there in the Maritimes. That's who we need to focus on coming over to our side. We've got Alberta and Saskatchewan in the bank. Yeah,
and that's why I personally have a hard time even getting concerned about voting at all, because in my riding, Bow River, the Conservatives going to win. So whether I add my popularity approval to the CPC candidate makes zero difference. That's aside from the fact that the election is going to be likely decided at the Ontario border once the polls close. So for me, my view has become of late, none of these parties represent me. None of them do. None of them actually want to say the right to life means a right to life for human beings. None of them want to get rid of administrative monetary penalties. which in itself is an overturning of the constitutional principle that justice must precede the application of power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
No,
punishment before you've actually been found guilty of anything.
that's right. And none of them wants to talk about things like that we're becoming a society where we have to ask for permission for everything we do. If you want to open a business, you got to ask for permission. If you want to put up a house, you got to ask for permission. If you want to put a deck in your backyard on your house, on your property, you have to ask for permission. The Constitution says, or our constitutional doctrine used to be that unless there's a law prohibiting something, we're free to do it. And now this country is so populated and rife and overrun with laws that it has left very little room for our freedom. And so what party is going to attack that? Mm-hmm. And so in my view, by me casting a vote, I could be endorsing the system that I don't like. And I don't think there's any going into the system to defeat the system. That doesn't happen. If you look at people who get into political jobs, they all become parts of the system eventually because it's alluring. And by casting a vote, I'm endorsing the system as it is. So I'm just going to abstain from voting. And I figure if I don't vote, and because I have no viable candidates to vote for, then I can critique the government after the fact because I didn't worship the state and participate in that particular ritual that I'm being told I need to do. And so for me, I don't feel I have any responsibility then for whether or not Carney is elected because I didn't choose or not choose him. And same with the CPC. I didn't choose or not choose it. So I can critique them because I am not part of this system.
Right. Of course, Conservative Party voters would angrily accuse you of supporting Carney by not going out and doing your duty to vote Conservative. Yeah. I saw the Maxime Bernier's interview with Tucker Carlson. I mean, I was kind of fascinated by what was going on in the comments box or the chat. Yeah. It was just all the stream of these CPC voters just saying Maxime's a fraud. Anyone who votes with People's Party are traitors to Canada. You're handing the election to Carney, etc. I have to say, I did vote myself, and I'll say I voted for People's Party because they're not perfect, but they're probably the closest to someone who's at least looking at addressing some of these issues. And, just as, it's a protest vote because, so it's a similar situation what you're talking about. Like, I'm not going to vote Conservative or Liberal because that's the system. And, and I'm sure not voting NDP. And that's all there was in my riding. Yeah. It wasn't anyone else. It was just Liberal, Conservative, NDP, and People's Party. So because my riding is one of the ones that flips back and forth, so I think the Green Party strategically ran no candidate to try to ensure that the Liberals won, which, that's another ridiculousness. Like, why do you even exist as a party? If you're going to pull candidates so the Liberals can win, why don't you just merge with the Liberal Party then? But
and the other thing is I wish we could vote for Prime Minister separately from voting for an MP.
Well, that's a whole other ball of wax. That's what I've complained about. Is the problem is we don't actually have a sovereign, really, because our sovereign doesn't exercise any power. The executive branch, by the fact that the monarch and the governor general in place of the monarch just does whatever the prime minister tells them. Yeah. You've now created a situation where the legislative and the executive branch are, for all intents and purposes, one and the same. That's way too much power for one person to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we see examples of that all throughout the COVID period. And when's the last time we saw the disallowance used? Like, it's a constitutional power that legislation can be disallowed. And I think it was, I think it might have been used in the 80s, and it was used, I think, against Aberhart here in Alberta. So we're talking like 1930s or something. But like, even the powers that are available, they don't use. Our political masters would rather use the courts and pervert the courts and then say, look, there's a constitutional ruling there. And the problem that I have with that, instead of using the constitutional powers they have, to get rid of legislation at the federal level that they don't like and maintain control that way, is because at least there's no binding precedents that result from the exercise of that political power. But when it becomes a court decision, it seems like the court is deputized at many times to do what the government wishes. When that happens, we're saddled, presumably forever, with a constitutional decision. And I would prefer that we didn't end up in that state where we're just in a straitjacket of decisions, and we can't break free, and Canada can't develop.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's forever, because it seems like there's certain topics and certain times where the courts are like, well, things have evolved in Canada, so now that decision is no longer good, and we're revisiting this and we're changing it. Of course, it seems to only ever be in a
it's a ratchet,
liberal, godless direction, rather than in a like, hey, wait a minute, we're gonna go in a more
it's a ratchet. It goes one way. And I mean, as our discussion about politics, when we, as Canadians, choose to elect the CPC, all the bureaucrats remain. That's the real government, and they're unelected and they're hidden behind the scenes. But we change the figurehead. The management of the program changes, but all they do is they stop turning the ratchet momentarily, and the Liberals are elected, and the ratchet turns again. It's like putting up a tent trailer, if you've ever done that. There's a ratchet on a tent trailer so that the trailer doesn't collapse. And I mean, that's what's happening now. And I don't see any reason to vote, because when you take a long view of it, what's going to happen? Well, we'll have a temporary reprieve. That's the best you can hope for with the CPC. And the CPC is so busy pandering and trying to appear non-conservative and non-right-wing and non-freedom. They're so busy working on those people that hate them, that won't vote for them. They're so busy pandering to them that they're forgetting about those of us who actually want a better Canada. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. It's been a great conversation. So, Derek, thanks a lot for coming on. I've just got to say the obligatory disclaimer that nothing we discussed here on this episode was legal advice. If you need legal advice, call a lawyer so you can get something specific to the situation you're dealing with. As always, we're open to suggestions or questions of topics you'd like to see us cover. So please send an email to the email address running along the little border thing on the bottom there. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, informative, please like, share, subscribe, comment. It's especially the liking and the commenting that's going to get these videos a bit more traction, a bit more views. So thanks again, Derek, for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.